الصبح قبل ما اطلع بقولوا لي تقعدنا قبل ما تطلع مطرح عشان يشوفوني يوم بطلع على الشغل. بقول امهم او الي تقعدنا عشان اشوفك قبل ما تطلع. يوم بطلع بقعدهم مش بيصيروا يحكوا لامهم. ابوي ليه طلع ما كلناش وهيك.
Hi, everybody. Just a few words of welcome. I mean, I think I'm a lucky person. Like, I have a lot of good luck. And the best sign of that is that if every now and then you meet somebody that's just astonishing and makes everything you've been doing yourself seem irrelevant and insignificant. And your speaker tonight is one of those people. And it's sort of great when the person that you meet that makes everything you do seem stupid is an architect, because it means at least you didn't make a stupid decision about which field to be in. But so rare it is to find an architect that has been able to take what it is that I mean, architects all have two things in common. One is stupidity, because they are in a discipline whose relationship to culture is always precarious, so they always have to argue for architecture. The dentist doesn't have to argue for teeth, for example. And the second great thing that architects share is they're in love. They're absolutely in love with buildings. And that's the second one is the explanation of the first one. Because they're in love, they go crazy. And they don't think about getting an important job like being a plumber or a lawyer or something like that. So to meet an architect that transforms their love of buildings into love in a deeper sense, this is an amazing thing. And that it happens through preservation is super, super interesting. I think we're very used to the idea that preservation teaches the other disciplines of the built environment to take care. I mean, preservation is always a kind of a warning, but here it's at some completely different scale. This is an architect trained at the great school at AUB and American University of Beirut, Michigan, Edinburgh, which is itself already an amazing combination if you think about Lebanon, the States, and Scotland. Brought up in the astonishingly beautiful city of Amman. That's a city in which the oldest street in archaeological evidence was found, Neolithic street, which makes Jericho seem like a latecomer. So literally a city sitting not only at the great intersection of everything, but literally, in a certain sense, the birthplace of our concept of what a city is. But then somebody who falls in love, if I understand right, as a tourist to the West Bank, falls in love with somebody in Ramallah, so love again, and so lives in Ramallah, and moves there, and then writes this sort of shocking book. And there are big issues facing our world, like peace, poverty, water, equity, social justice, but the biggest of all is surely mother-in-laws. I mean, because this seems to be the least likely to be solved, and this astonishingly elegant book in 19 different languages describing what it means to be, as it were, forced to live with one's mother-in-law during a 42-day curfew, so as it were, to develop also an intimate relationship with the man who imprisoned you with your mother-in-law in this way, in this case Sharon, produces this amazing book, Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, which is literally, I think, in something like 19 or something languages, but it's again a book full of humor and tenderness, and it keeps going and going. I mean, if I say anything more, it will be a problem. But I have to say something. Important part of the peace delegation in Washington, but probably even more important to my naive mind, to be very, very active in initiatives between Palestinian and Israeli women. And it seems to me, again, the different kind of care for the situation. Also a member of government, Director General of the Ministry of Culture. But for us tonight, founder and director of the Rewalk Center for Architectural Conservation that you saw the film, which is starting in 1991, devoted to the conservation of the architectural heritage of Palestine, and premised on an amazing observation, it seems to me, that something like, and I noticed it was 50 buildings and 50,000 more to go. There's something about the number 5 here, because there's an argument made that 50% of the heritage is in 50 of the villages. So if one took care of those 50 villages, you would actually be taking care of the heritage, not just of individual villages, but of the collective of the nation, or that which was and will be a nation. So then the sort of 50 villages project. But again, I would say why it's a real honor to the school that you are here. You are already one of our teachers, because the attitude is quite different than you would find in other preservation contexts. When the director of the Historic Preservation Program here and myself went to the center, we were immediately students. We were immediately wanting to learn more, because in this situation, not only is this remarkable number of villages being thought about, But it's not just that the building is saved. The people who save the building then develop a new set of skills. NGOs are typically, if I remember rightly, kind of installed in the building for the first few years. So there is a kind of social care as well. And so basically, homes are turned back into homes not simply by being preserved. And you will notice that almost all of the buildings are houses. So there is a domesticity to the whole operation at its scale, and the creating of homes, the creating of jobs, and it's not by accident that the guy is talking about his children when describing his work. Anyway, for these and a million reasons, it means the fact that I'm going to walk out after saying this, horrific. And I remember when I started this job, one thing that somebody said to me, don't ever, ever introduce somebody and walk out. And this is the first time I ever did it, and I super apologize, and I hope you realize how ashamed I feel, and you will after you hear this talk, which I'm super jealous that I'm going to miss. But I think this is one of the great figures in the field of historic preservation, a field that we, of course, regard as more important than small things like peace initiatives, and that's evidenced by the poster which presents the single most radical proposal imaginable. As I said before, the only advantage of that poster is if this is the proposal, there's such a great room for compromise, and one could, as it were, scale down this procedure and have a major victory. Anyway, you do us great honor, and it is our deep wish that students from architecture, preservation, and planning will be actively collaborating and being students, and we would also like to learn how to do it, and to do it with this kind of care. Once again, you touch the school very deeply already, and please feel at home.
Well, I wish Mark would stay and continue the lecture. He's done a better job than myself. I'm sorry you're leaving because you could have done it better than myself. Well, I am really delighted to be here in the GSAPP. I asked how to pronounce the GSAPP, and then I was told GSAPP is the name. Well, thank you very much for all of you being here, and I would like to thank Ben for also inviting me. And this started actually almost a year ago, where Columbia University has a center in Amman with Safwan Masri as the director. And then he came to Palestine, Ramallah. We went out, and as he said, love from the first sight, and it was. And then we had the dean come visit us in Palestine. He came to Riwaq, and also with Chairman Andrew. And I am delighted to know after almost 8 months of correspondence, I am here to share with you the experience of Riwaq. And I thank you for coming here. I am delighted that the revolution in Egypt is over, at least for the time being, because I wouldn't have had any chance of having any one of you sitting and listening about historic preservation rather than listening to about Egypt. Probably some of you are here because of the map. I don't know how many of you noticed the map of the poster, which included Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And I think many people thought that this lecture is going to be about how the Palestinians became Egyptians and liberated the whole area. It's not the case. Some people are here because they thought Israel occupied all of the area. It's not the case. Some people who call for a one-state solution or a confederation between Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. It's not the case. It's just a graphic designer imagination. And I just want to tell you something about myself, because I think normally I don't like to stand in front of a person not knowing who they are. So I want to just give a personal touch to it. Actually, today, as I was putting a few notes about this lecture, I realized that there were 2 curfews in my life that changed my life. The first curfew happened in 1991 with the first Gulf War. Sharon put us under 42 days of curfew, which meant we couldn't leave the house. And what would you do for 42 days, not going to school, not teaching, not working? I kept thinking, and the idea of Riwaq came about. And that's why Riwaq started in 1991. Now, in 2003, 2002, Sharon put us under another curfew for 42 days this time. And as a result, I ended up writing my memoirs. And that's what Mark referred to as a book called Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. And the book is about two occupations. One is Sharon and the Israeli army, which occupied my town, Ramallah. And the other occupation is my mother-in-law's, who occupied my house and drove me crazy. So I ended up with two occupations. And believe me, I went to architecture because I am dyslexic. You don't know how difficult I find it to spell words, you know. I don't know how many of you here are dyslexic, but I think I went to study architecture. So because you know how we architects, we like sort of looking at maps and photographs and hardly read. And to my biggest surprise, I became a writer by pure accident as a result of the success of Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. And since 2005, actually, I've been traveling all over the world talking about my mother-in-law. So if I bore you today with my architectural presentation, you would know why, because I haven't done it for quite a bit of time. I want to share with you my experience as an architect, and just one more anecdote before I get serious, become an architect. I was a graduate of the American University of Beirut, the Department of Architecture, and I failed every single structure course. Anything that has to do with mathematics, I was terrible with, again with dyslexia, because every 42 was 24 and every 64 was 46 and what have you. So I failed all the structural courses. But in the year 2008, I was called by AUB to be given a prize by the Department of Architecture or the School of Engineering, and I was totally surprised. But it has nothing to do with my architectural achievement. It has to do with Sharon and my mother-in-law again. So, as I said, Riwaq, I will be showing you a film about Riwaq, but before we do that, I would really like to share with you the experience of what is Riwaq and what is the status of the cultural heritage in Palestine. Riwaq, which was started in 1991, is an NGO, is a non-government organization who is trying very hard to protect the cultural heritage in Palestine. And I don't say Palestinian architecture, I say architecture in Palestine, because we are trying to protect all layers in Palestine, meaning that I partly feel Greek, I partly feel Roman, I partly feel Byzantine, I partly feel Christian, I partly feel Muslim, I partly feel Jewish, I partly feel Turkish, I partly feel all of those. And it is very important to have this approach to preservation and not to take a political stand concerning protection or conservation and try to protect one layer only. Now, as a child, I grew up in Damascus, and any of you who have been to Damascus would realize the impact of those streets on a little girl going around, also Al-Hamadiyya. I happen to be lucky to be living in a beautiful old house, the Jabri house. My mother came from Damascus, so I grew up in a courtyard house that must have left some imprints in my mind, the atmosphere. For me, architecture is really the atmosphere, the ambiance that is created. And when I was studying architecture in AUB in the 70s, it was the modern school of architecture, and I hated it. I did not relate neither to the school, to the scale, nor to the modern materials, and I always look for the atmosphere in a space. And I figure out it has to do with space, it has to do with the scale of the place and of the event, the human being, what are they doing, and how they're relating to the space. Being Palestinian, I would not hide the fact that I was also traumatized by the loss of my parents' house in Jaffa. Also traumatized by the fact that Palestinians' villages, 420, were totally demolished, bulldozed by the Israelis between the year 48 and 52. And that must have left a little fear inside me that Palestine will disappear. All of those together, Damascus, my mother's visiting Italy when I was 18, I must admit, also had an impact of what equality of space means and what life in a space or in a city or in a town really means. And all of those made me go on a visit to Palestine in 1981. I grew up in Jordan as a refugee, Palestinian refugee, and I knew nobody in Palestine. And I did not know how Palestine looked like, neither the villages nor the architecture for that matter. And at the end of the day, I went to Palestine to discover it, like hopefully all of you would be joining us soon to work on some of these houses. Now, all of this made me start Riwaq in 91. And Riwaq today is trying to protect the cultural heritage, but not from a material point of view, not from an architectural point of view, but actually trying to tie the social aspect, the economic aspect with the architectural aspect. And we have created two programs that I will tell you more about. One is called Job Creation Through Conservation. We have realized that people have to benefit from their houses. It's not enough for me to go and talk about the history of the place or the beauty of the place. If people don't benefit, and I mean benefit, either get a job or get a house or get a kindergarten, they have to benefit from those spaces for them to relate to. In Palestine, it is very difficult to protect cultural heritage or historic buildings for the reasons that we all share, not only in Palestine, but also in America and in North Europe and in India and everywhere. And in Palestine, we have many challenges that I would share with you, but I would like to show you a 12-minute film to tell you more about Riwaq before I move on into the issues of conservation.
Welcome to Riwaq. Riwaq was established in 1991 with the purpose of protecting cultural heritage in Palestine. We're based in Ramallah, but our work covers the West Bank with a special emphasis on rural areas. This small presentation will walk you through our goals, our programs, and our future plans. Our main philosophy is that protection of cultural heritage for the sake of protection is neither feasible nor sustainable. Our objective is to re-establish the relationship between heritage and socio-economic and cultural activities, to make people see and feel the potentials of investing in heritage. In Palestine, heritage can and should be a main component of a better future, a future that respects, celebrates, and builds on the past. Our programs are multidisciplinary. We work along different but parallel paths. Our work started with the biggest project yet, the National Registry of all historic buildings in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Hundreds of students worked with us to register the 50,320 buildings in 422 sites in Palestine over a period of 10 years. The gathered information can be seen in a 3-volume publication or online on ruwaqregister.org. Another pillar in Ruwaq's work is the single building rehabilitation project. This has resulted so far in more than 100 renovated public buildings and has managed to show the 100 or so communities that such buildings can become alive again, hosting all kinds of services and activities. Renovated buildings have become attraction points for local community members and visitors alike. Many cultural activities such as the PAL Fest and the Sounding Jerusalem Festival has used these buildings as venues, bringing new cultural experiences to many remote locations and contributing to a new mental image of Palestine. This has also contributed to putting many villages and towns such as Ras Karkar, Beit Wazan and Zahriye on the map of alternative tourism, creating potential economic gains to those places. In addition to gaining a venue for activities and services, spending around $5 million on restoration has resulted in the generation of around 170,000 working days for unemployed workers and has trained hundreds of these workers on new building skills and helped revive traditional crafts that were almost lost. Working on single buildings made us realize that we need to intervene on a larger scale, the scale of historic centers as a whole. This means the preventive conservation of entire blocks of buildings and public spaces, the rehabilitation of street infrastructure, the planting of trees, the development of protection plans and strategic documents with the community. From experience, each site has its own problems and potentials. Some historic centers can be developed for tourism, while others are needed by the community for housing. But in all cases, these centers can be the hubs for social, cultural, and economic activities, and this is what we want to see. Of course, this work is not possible without the real and direct involvement of the community. Our programs target different sectors and operate on both the national and local levels. 100,000 school children participated in our annual drawing competition. 50 teachers participated in our 2009 training for extracurricular activities. Every year, we train more than 10 architects and students on conservation techniques. And last year alone, we planted around 500 trees in historic centers. In 2005, we started the Ruwaq Biennale. With 3 editions so far, the Biennale has become a biannual opportunity for interaction. It provides a venue for exchange between international experts, practitioners, and interested individuals with the local community in the different locations of our work. Over the years, we have published 11 books on Palestinian cultural heritage.
الجيب، بيت وزن، جلجلية، عين سينيا، جبع، قور، راس كركر، خان يونس.
Those are the names of the 50 historic centers we have prioritized for our work in the coming 10 years. From the past 20 years of experience, as you have seen, we have been racing to protect our heritage, racing to put this heritage on the national map, and striving to connect this work to our national priorities. The idea of the 50 came from the fact that these 50 centers comprise 50% of our architectural heritage in rural Palestine. The idea of this project is actually quite simple. We have 50 almost abandoned historic centers made up from 20,000 historic buildings and are home to the poorest segments of the community. At a time when we as Palestinians need housing, need services, need spaces for social and cultural interactions, and are in a very dire economic need. Those 20,000 buildings and surrounding spaces can solve many of the problems we suffer from. By regenerating these centers, we can provide at least 10,000 housing units, create tens of thousands of working days, rehabilitate spaces that are environmentally and child-friendly, provide spaces for economic activity, and create an alternative tourism map of Palestine, a map that celebrates people and their way of life. This project is about the best use of resources and the safeguarding of our environment. Why build new residential quarters and facilities when at no cost to the environment one can use already existing spaces, built in a very socially friendly manner? Why build playgrounds at the far edge of town when one can save transportation costs and create playgrounds in spaces that are safe for children? Why leave such areas abandoned, attracting criminal activities, while at minimal costs we can make them incubators for socio-economic and cultural development? Heritage in Palestine is not only ours. It's the heritage of the entire humanity, but we are its keepers. It's not and should not be a static piece in a museum. It can be a lever that lifts us into the future. We truly believe in the potentials of this heritage, and we want you to be on our side.
بدرس بالكمبيوتر. امتى بلشت تدرسي؟ عام 2005. كنا بيتنا قريب على الكمانجاتي. كنت دايما ألعب مع صحباتي. كان يرموا هذا المركب، كان عبارة عن حوش قديم.
Okay, before I open, I want to speak for 10 minutes just to give you, to focus on three programs that we have done in Riwaq, and then I would like to just open the floor and have an open discussion. I want to tell you about three things. One, what we call the Happy Marriage program. It's difficult to believe that marriage could be happy, but we tried, and I think we have been successful. And then the international campaign for the revitalization of the 50 villages and Riwaq's Biennale. These are the three things that I would like to share with you. Now, the first one, as we try to illustrate in the film here, Riwaq at the very beginning, when we started, we didn't know what to do, what cultural heritage in Palestine was. And the best way to start, we thought, is to get to know what we have. So we started what we call the National Register of Historic Buildings. Hundreds of students, every single student of architecture or professor or person in history or archaeology in the 5 universities of Palestine went out to collect information on the 50 villages. We ended up having what we called a listing or an inventory that you could see online. Unfortunately, it's only in Arabic, I think, with a summary in English. But basically, we know what we have now. And as a result of understanding what we have, we looked into the 50 villages, 50,000 buildings, and we found out that instead of working on 420 villages, only if we concentrate on 50 of them, we will preserve 50% of our historic buildings. In other words, 50 of these sites have 50%, and that's why we started the international campaign to protect these 50 sites. Now, the Happy Marriage started in 2000, in the year 2000, when again Sharon seemed to play a very important role in my life, unfortunately. In the year 2000, Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, woke up one day and decided he doesn't want to have any workers to work in Israel. It means that 150,000 Palestinians woke up one day and did not have a job, which means almost 1 million Palestinians woke up one day without an income, which is 1/3 of the population. And at that point, we just felt in Riwaq that we have to have a role in the alleviation of employment or unemployment. And we started this project called Job Creation. Basically, we came up with the following idea. Now, many of the buildings in Palestine, in the villages, Riwaq only work in the rural areas. The majority of buildings in the historic centers are empty. So if an owner is willing to give the use of that building for 10 years, we will be willing to raise the funds to renovate his or her building. Meanwhile, in these 10 years, an NGO from the same community, which as you can see here, it's either music, children music, mostly we encourage cultural activities, can use this building for free for the coming 10 or 15 years. The NGO in a village and the owner of the house will come out with an agreement that the owner would allow them to use it for free. Meanwhile, Riwaq would raise the funds and do the conservation. So the owner is happy and the NGO is happy because they're using it for free. Now, the contractors that work with us, we have to have training. We do run training courses for architects and workers and contractors. So we are trying to make them gain a skill. Now, the contractors, it's an open tender, so we put it in the newspaper and people apply. Now, who gets the job among the contractors? We have a point or system in which hiring people from the community is one major point of winning that bid. It means you cannot bring workers from Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Ramallah, or any of those cities and take them to this little village. You have to hire people from the village, and if they don't have the skill, we can train them, and only in rare cases we will allow workers from other villages to come in or from other areas. We don't always succeed, but we try. So the community really starts seeing that this project is an income for them. The community starts feeling that there is a music center, as you saw in this old historic center. The owner is happy, and we started looking at the people rather than at the stone, and this is very important. The minute we started realizing that really conservation is about improving the social conditions of people who are living in that area, because we architects, I talk as an architect, we have a problem. At least when I studied, it was more about the material proportions and what have you, and we forget about the people who are using that space. Now, we shifted our work from the happy marriage. We still do single buildings. Then we realized that it's not enough. The single building has been successful because it showed the people the potential and uses of their buildings. So you could make an old building into a modern building with a heating, with lighting, with good services, because that's why people left their historic buildings. We started working on the village as a whole. And that's why we have the rehabilitation project, and that's the beginning of the 50 villages. And now we are working on 5 villages. And shortly what we do is we do a social and economic study of that village. Our aim is to make the services and the living conditions in the old town equal, if not better, than the rest of the town. Because as it stands today, the historic centers are really badly served. Only the poor, the elderly lives there. There is hardly schools. There's hardly any services for the community. So if we come in and try to do infrastructure, just to give you an example, we worked on Bir Zayt, which is the town in old city next to the university. We have done infrastructural work. Our partners are the community. Our partners are the NGOs in the place, and our partners are the architects and any other person who can, the workers who can help or do the work themselves. Now we have started working on rehabilitation. What we do, I'm getting technical, but I want to do that for those of you who are interested in the issues of conservation. We do social and economic studies. We want to really understand the situation, who lives there, what they work, what is it that they work, where do they work, what is the level of education, what are their problems, how do they want their town to look like, why is it that they're leaving it, what would make them stay in it. Second, we try to serve those who are already there. Before we start thinking we want people to come back, we want to make sure that people who live there don't leave it. So we do a program to serve the people who are already living there by giving them an upgrading of their houses. And it's only a $10,000 a piece, a house. And this is kind of, you know, instead of going and spending $70,000 for a new apartment, you give 10 to 15,000 for an old house, and then you change the bathroom, the lighting, and basically the kitchen. And people would become happy in it. So to rehabilitate means that we have to attract people to make people stay, but also attract them to come into these areas. And we don't have a magic solution, as you all know. Each town, we expect successes. For example, we took Bir Zayt, which is close to the university, because we thought it was a success story. And we took one of the biggest and the most remote villages next to Hebron, Al-Dahriye, which is the biggest village, which is a town now, because we thought we will have a success story and a more difficult story. The success was the one next to Hebron, the remote area where we did not think we will succeed. Why? Because people appreciated somebody coming and asking about them. Why? Because those who know politics of Palestine, they are Hebronites. I don't know what is the equal of Hebronites in America, but it's a local joke about, an internal joke about Hebronites being very stubborn, very backward, but in reality they are very entrepreneurs. You know, they just took pride in their town, and we had planners sitting down and marking things in red as school and yellow as clinic and what have you. We go back, they're all being used, but in reverse colors. Doesn't matter, you know. So at the end of the day, really, I just want to tell you that we have just started this the international campaign of revitalizing these villages. Of course, it's not as easy as I am trying to make it sound, as you all know. And I would really, really hope that one day we will have a program with you in Colombia, in the Department of Architecture, Planning and Preservation here, to look together at some of these towns. And I am going to be here, so we'll probably will have more and more informal meetings to sort of come to develop something. I will stop here, because I am a hakawati, as they say in Arabic. If you give me a microphone, I never give it back, but this time I will try to stop for 5 minutes, and if you don't ask questions, I will just continue talking. Yes, please.
My name's Abdal Manam. I have two questions. These buildings that are being restored, are they being designed by someone? And if so, by who? Or are they being restored to a previous state that they were before? And if they are, where are you getting that information from? And then my second question is, can you speak a little bit about the difficulty of doing all this work under the constant threat of all of it being destroyed in one day or in any given moment?
Okay, I will start with the more bright, the easier one. Actually, Riwaq, as an institution, we are 15 to 20 of us. The majority are architects and archaeologists. We have two missions. One is to raise the funds, as I mentioned before, and second is to do the conservation, to supervise the conservation and to do the architectural work and prepare the tender documents and work as conservation architects. So far we have been doing things in-house, but soon I think it looks like we will be handing it out to some of the offices, architectural offices, because of the scale of the work is becoming a little bit too much, and also to involve others. So it is RIWAQ so far that has been doing the architectural design and supervising. We do have architects who go to ICROM and do some courses here and there, and or study conservation. So we are quite equipped to do this kind of work. Now, as for the use, did you ask for, sorry, the second part of your question was about what are they used for? Or? Yes. No, this is the second, but I thought the first question had another. Yes, that's what I meant. Well, okay, the information is sometimes oral history is quite strong in Palestine, so we do ask people about what they know about this building. We try to look for photos or written information. We don't always succeed. And I must say that sometimes at the beginning of our conservation, we were not very sincere in doing the research. You know, architects are very keen on starting the work without doing much research, and our co-director, who was an archaeologist, always complained that we never did enough research on. Now, you have to remember that not all of these buildings are monuments in the sense that we have to keep them in the shape and form that they first exist. We do have a challenge of having people use their buildings, and we don't use them, we don't treat them in a very sacred way, except for those few that we mark. We do what we call classification. One of the research that we do, architectural study of that fabric, is to decide the intervention. We do divide them into A, B, and C, and then we put regulations to each one of them. But I would say the majority of them, because they are housing, we try as much as possible not to be too conservative about not touching your own building still, because people don't want to use them still. So it really depends on the value of that building or its statement of importance. Now, as to demolitions, well, we are living in a political conflict, and I can tell you the following, that one of the difficulties we have, I don't know, I mean, demolition of housing, I hope, of whole villages, I hope we never see again. It happened in '48, and I do hope that in the history of Palestine, we don't see it again. But we have another kind of demolition, which is the development, which is happening from the Palestinians ourselves. I mean, like modern development, and every time there is a boom in Palestine, we conservation architects, we suffer a great deal. Now, the occupation influences us in the following way. I don't know how many of you realize that if we talk about the West Bank, forget Gaza for the time being, in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has control over only 12% of Palestinian land. These are areas that are defined as areas A, B, and C. Now, area A and B are the villages and towns that Palestinians live on, built-up areas. And these A and B are only 12% of the West Bank. The rest, 88%, is C area, which is still under Israeli occupation and jurisdiction, and these are where the settlements are being built. How does that influence the conservation? It means all our historic centers or our historic cities are sitting on this 12% or 10%. Now, if I give you a case of Ramallah, for example, the whole table here is the land of Ramallah. And this is the built-up area of Ramallah. Literally 90% of the Ramallah land is sea area, and A area is only that little paper. Now, the whole population, and keeping in mind that 40 years under Israeli occupation, we were not allowed to build like is Jerusalem today. So since 93 or 94, 95, when we got our national authority, Palestinian National Authority, we were allowed by our authority and by the Israelis to build on that little paper. So you have people making up for the 40 years of not building, in addition to land speculation. If you want to buy a land in Ramallah today, in that piece of paper, you will have to, and to build the house, you will have to pay at least $300,000. In a nice area, $500,000. While if you buy 1 dunam, which is 1,000 square meter, on that table, it will be $10,000. So the historic centers that we are trying to protect are in the center of this paper. So you can imagine the kind of pressure we have from the people, from the private sector, from the politicians, from our government, people accusing us every single day that we are anti-development. Now, lucky enough that these historic centers really are only 0.5% or 1% of that piece of paper. So we always argue, do your development on the 99% of the land, do your great architecture on the 99th, and let us just protect this 1% of that piece of paper. So these are the difficulties that indirectly or directly we have from the Israelis. If we ever get the 90%, we're not talking about Jaffa, Haifa, or getting back historic Palestine. We are talking only getting jurisdiction over our West Bank. Then there will be a little bit of a release on the historic centers. But these are one of the major problems we have. Another problem we have is the laws. We still have British laws. We were ruled in Palestine after the First World War. We became British mandate in 1922 or 23 until 47, and the laws are still there. The British were only interested in archaeological sites. They were not really interested in Ottoman buildings, because most of the houses we have are during the Ottoman period, 300, 400, 500 years old. So the laws that we have in Palestine now, after having our Palestinian National Authority for the last 16 years, we still have the same rules. So Riwaq is working as the conscience of people. We don't have any laws that protect these historic buildings. If somebody wants to come up tomorrow and demolish their house, we cannot stop them. So we're working indirectly with the municipalities to come up with bylaws and zoning regulations in which we can protect these historic buildings. Sure. Yes, please.
The West Bank, and also could you talk a little bit about
sorry, what was the first one again?
The first one is, what is the title environment like, and can people perfect their ownership pretty easily in old abandoned buildings? And then the second question is, what are the opportunities like in Gaza, because you've really been focusing on the West Bank?
Yeah, well, actually we were working in Gaza, and when we did our national register, Gaza was part of it. But since, I would say, 96 up till now, of course, since 2006, nobody has been able to enter Gaza. But even before that, it is almost impossible for a Palestinian like myself to reach to Gaza. It's impossible for me to reach Jerusalem. It's impossible for me to reach Israel. So, I mean, you touched on another issue that I had forgotten to mention, actually. It's very difficult sometimes to move about in the West Bank, because in a place which is, I always tell the Italians, it's the size of Elba, but here it doesn't mean much, the Isle of Elba. Palestine is really very, very tiny, and the West Bank has almost 550 checkpoints, so it's difficult to move about. And that's why, unfortunately, I don't mention Gaza because we have stopped working in Gaza because we cannot reach Gaza. As for ownership and title of the land and houses, we have two situations. If we are talking about houses and ownership within the city, it's a very clear private ownership that has been registered, and people know exactly the title of their houses. There is a problem with land in general, especially in the sea areas, because again, we can always say the problem is either from the British or the Israelis. It's very easy for the Palestinians. We're not responsible to any of our mistakes. But there is something called the land registration that happened in the 40s, in which the British were trying to register each person's land, and we call it taswiye. And this did not happen, and now people know exactly their lands, and they do have proofs, but for the Israelis it's a very complex issue. But when it comes to historic centers, we don't have any of those problems. Of course, we have a problem of divided ownership, because a little house that you saw here could be owned by 70 people. 5 of them are in Birzeit, and the 65 are in California or in Chile or in South. So we do have a problem with ownership, but that's double effect. On the one hand, it's good because it means that people can easily donate their buildings or do something public. That's why it's very easy for someone to agree to give us their building or the community to use it. On the other hand, it makes our life difficult sometimes, that the ownership is quite divided and not easy to solve. But it has its implication on our work. Thank you.
Kind of planning that's more at the city scale, or is it mostly sort of from building to building? I mean, you mentioned zoning, but do you also do interventions in the urban fabric in general, or infrastructure, that kind of thing?
Yes. I didn't spend enough time on those, but yes. As I said, we started with single buildings, then we moved into the revitalization of a whole town. And what we do these are the following steps that we do. First, we do, as I mentioned before, a study. We have to understand the situation there. So we do have social, economic, architectural, environmental, and all the studies that you can think of that we need to understand and collect the information. We do have also the Architectural National Register that I mentioned. Now, next, we do the infrastructure. It's very important for us. We find out that improving the infrastructure in those villages will make all the community feels much better about itself. So infrastructure is one of the things that we start with. So we do all the electrical, mechanical, all the electrical and telephone and what have you, lines come down. And also we improve the street furniture, as you saw in some of these. Now, then we do 2-3 things at the same time. One is what we call a catalyst buildings. Instead of renovating, because renovating every single building really costs a lot of money, the average of $100,000 for each one of those buildings, so we don't have this kind of money. So what we do what we call catalyst or node projects in the different neighborhoods. So we will have 1, 2, 3 buildings. One could be a cultural center, one is for the municipality, and one for the university, for example. We think very strong what will bring people in. If we make it a post office, if we make it a clinic, so many times bringing people into the neighborhood is very important. But these are mostly decided, as I said, it's not enough for me to decide, things have to happen on the community level. So it is mostly the community that come up with the ideas, and they're the ones who run the building, and they're the ones who take. But we have catalyst building, and the money we bring, we also spend on something called preventive conservation. Preventive conservation is like making the whole town looks better. by cleaning it, by cleaning the facade of the buildings, by emergency fund, that if a building is about to fall, we sort of make the buildings or the whole historic center live for another 50 years. So if we cannot do it now, it's there for the coming years for us to work on. So this is what we call preventive conservation. Then we work, as I mentioned before, on housing. We start with the people who live there. We do have a we try as much as possible. If it's a small community, we serve the whole community, which means we give 10,000, we specify, we work, we sit with them and see what is it they want. They normally say kitchen, they normally say waterproof, they normally say a door or a window. And we try to serve the community that is there so they can stay. But also we look into the possibility of new uses for their buildings. Like in the case of Bir Zayt, for example. One person came and renovated a building and made it a restaurant there. Now, our philosophy really is to try as much as possible to have the community use the building and not to have it become like a museum or, you know, just people coming from outside or depending on tourism from outside, not that we have much. So yes, to answer your question is yes, we do work on the scale of the whole village. We look into environmental issues, into green, environmental and planting, sewage systems, water systems, all the environmental issues that were there in the past and people stopped using. And we look forward to new thinking. I hope that we can sit down and discuss other possibilities of how to go about things, but we try to work on the level. And as I told you, the municipality is our main partner in this. We work with the municipality, and often we help the municipalities to start a unit of conservation, and we hire an architect or two, and it is paid part of the project for the coming 2, 3, 4 years, so it is really owned. One of the most difficult part of our work is to make people feel, or for people to really own the project and not for us just to say it. And it is a challenge. Yes.
What's the time frame that you're looking at?
Right. Well, when we did our national register, we considered 50 years. And the reason for 50 years in the case of Palestine, of course, we looked into different countries, and different countries had 50 years or 100 years, depending, or 70 years. In our case, at that time when we started, 50 years was the end of this use of the cross vault, or the end of agrarian, depending on agriculture as a production mode in Palestine. Of course, it started much earlier in the 20s and 30s, but it reflected itself in the architecture sometime in the mid-40s. Now, as we all know as conservation architects, that the National Register should be updated. In other words, every 10 years, then it becomes the year 50, then 60, then 70, but we haven't done that because that's an army of work and the budget. You know, that research we did, it took us 13 years and it cost us $1 million to do that National Register, and we haven't been able to update and continue the work for it. So 50 years is, but as I told you, it is in our mind, in our practice, but we don't have a law that says that. Yes, please, and we also, yeah, go ahead.
Traditions. I don't know if you would agree with me that depending on the different traditions, the different cultures, the concepts such as conservation, restoration, renovation have slightly different meanings also. actually, besides this ones, conservation, renovation, restoration, I'd like to for a moment talk about the another one, which is I like to call resurrection. And
especially that we are in the Holy Land.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was going to point more at the Byzantine context, or the Byzantine tradition, which you mentioned that you are affected partly by it too. And I'm thinking about the enormous amount of religious buildings that Stalin destroyed in the 30s and 40s, Byzantine temples. And these ones are being renovated. Sorry, not renovated. They're being rebuilt from scratch. That's what I like to call resurrected. And it seems that in the best Byzantine tradition, they don't have any problem doing this. In other words, it doesn't affect whether it could be a pastiche or a Disneyland. For them, it's not. Yeah. It's real. It's authentic, even though it's been built yesterday. No? And under that light, under this Byzantine spirit, I would like to ask you, how would you feel about the possibility of resurrecting or building back from scratch the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in the 40s?
Well, we're trying to very hard to keep the ones that we have before resurrection. I mean, we do have a challenge of keeping the 400 that remained. And I would say that is a priority, a practical priority. But for, for discussion, I want to tell you the following, that a lot of this discussion really happens in our, in Riwaq as architects, because we do have different schools of thoughts. As you probably, we didn't have enough chance to look at the different buildings that we have renovated, but we do have people think differently. I am perhaps one of the more conservative ones in conservation. I always tell them that the building looked much better before we did it, which is true. Most of the time we go into a building and I love it, and after we have renovated, I said, oh my God, what we have done to the building. Of course, we have to be practical, and I think, as I mentioned, we are not a conservation group, even though some of us, in the sense that the building is more important than the human being. We are in a probably situation in which we are willing to compromise on the, the history of the building, if you want, but also who said, we have one architect amongst us who believes that the building is a living thing and we should allow it to build, and it's only a dream to keep a building as is. And he's right. I mean, the world changes, and we always have this static feeling as if, it was good in the past and it's not good anymore. So part of our work is really allowing for modification, allowing for additions, and sort of controlling how additions go or how changes go. Again, to your question about the destroyed villages, there has been one attempt actually with a group of Israeli Palestinian international architects that are trying to protect Lifta. Maybe some of you are on this mission. I must say it's not easy with the Israelis. Nothing is easy with the Israelis, but I think that it is important. Like, I don't know how many of you are aware of the District 6 museum in South Africa. This is an area that has been destroyed by apartheid government, and the people now in Cape Town came back, and they had a group called District 6. It was called District 6, and it was demolished because it was a mixed population there, and the white regime just demolished it and sent people away. And there is a museum now called District 6 where people from all over kept their history and the objects, the artifacts, they brought it. And they have a map. When you go into the District 6 museum, you have a map drawn of the houses, and people have come even before, the clerk, before the regime fell, They have collected the material and now they are rebuilding it. So maybe the political circumstances, you know, after seeing Egypt falling, Mubarak falling, everything is possible in that area, and that's why I say it is the Middle East and you never expect what will happen. So thank you, it's very interesting. We have a person there that has been trying, yes.
Thank you. Saad, thank you very much. You gave me a new hope and a new appreciation for Sharon. I'm curious how the name came about the Riwaq. If you can just tell me what it means, and I am embarrassed to say I haven't heard of your organization.
Don't worry, there are more important things in life that I haven't heard about myself. So.
I want to follow up with the other question about the villages that we lost. And has there been any energy or effort to even virtually create some of those villages? And have you branched out to deal with the what many talk about, the picturesque landscape of those villages that I know is probably hard to recreate?
Yes. Riwaq. Actually, you know, Riwaq in Arabic means a gallery. You know, like it's the group of arches, which is like a cloister in a building. That is a Riwaq. A Riwaq also is a very typical architectural element in Palestine in village houses. You walk into the courtyard, and part of that courtyard has a cross vault which is covered but open, which is a diwan, or it's called Riwaq. And also there was a school of Riwaqiyun. It was a philosophical school that the teacher, like Aristotle, would be walking in the gallery, and this group were called Riwaqiyun after him, like the gallerists. But to tell you the truth, when we started Riwaq, I decided to call it Muqarnas. I don't know how many of you know what Muqarnas is. Muqarnas is, what is it in English? Satellites, satellite, what is it called? Stelas? Yes, what is it in English? Stalactite. Stalactite. You know, this is like an intellectual professor of architecture at Birzeit University starting an organization, and it calls its organization Muqarnas. And in Arabic, it's like in English. I can hardly pronounce the word. So we went out, and there is actually Alec Grabar, you know, the art historian of Islamic art in Harvard, has a magazine called Muqarnas, and that's why I thought, you know, I wanted to be the intellectual Saad, call it Muqarnas. Then we started working in the street and telling the peasants or the normal people, Muqarnas. What? Burnos? You know, burnos is like the bathroom robe that you wear, you know. It's like burnos. And people, nobody had an idea what it was all about and what it meant, and they distorted. At the end of the day, we said, come on, Saad, just pick up a word that everybody knows, and Riwaq is the word that everybody knows. Because everybody, if you go to a village, they will say, come and see, let me show you our Riwaq. So that's how the name came about. Now, about the destroyed villages, I am happy to tell you in a sense that there has been very intensive work done on preserving the history, the social history, and the description of that, of the 42 villages. There is a book called All That Remains in English, and in Arabic it's called Kay La Nansa, so we do not forget. This book is published by published by Professor Walid Khalidi, and it is a publication of the Institute of Palestine Studies. And there has been a documentation, like our national register. People went, researchers went to Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, wherever the Palestinian refugees existed, went around and asked them and to describe the village and to draw a map about the village. So there is an interesting documentation, but I wouldn't say an architectural documentation. And there is Abu Sitte, what's his first name? Salman Abu Sitte also has done work on the Palestinian villages, the names, and it's very intriguing because there is also a very interesting book written by an Israeli geographist, by Benvenesti, and it's called The Palestinian Sacred Landscape. And it's one of the interesting resources because it comes from the other side. And he was a boy, or he was 10 years old when he used to go around with his dad. His dad was a geographer, and his dad's mission was to take the map, the British map, that had Arab names of the villages, and just go and start making up new names that sounds either Hebrew names. And he talks about the Judaization of names of the place. And it's quite intriguing because he says how many times really it has nothing to do biblical or nothing historical, but they will create names that will... the whole issue of geography, archaeology, is quite a field between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, one of the most annoying thing is how much that place changes all the time on you to a point where you feel a stranger all the time. But that's a completely different topic. I always say time and space in Palestine have a completely different meaning. You never know when you get to a place, and every 2 years the place changes on you. You don't know where you are. We are a continuous cinema paradiso in that part of the world. Let's try to keep it. Yes.
I was a little bit curious about where you get your funding and where most of your support comes from.
Right.
What your relationship is with the PA, if they offer any support at all. And then also, I know the water infrastructure in the West Bank isn't too great. If you could just speak about the infrastructures and any hurdles that you have to go over with that too in the West Bank.
Okay. As far as funding is concerned, for the longest time, our main funder was Sweden. And the reason for that, Sweden is very interested in culture, not only in cultural heritage, but also in culture and in hospitals. These are the specialized Swedes. So SIDA, which is not SIDA, the Canadian SIDA, the Swedish has been our main funder. But also we have funding from other resources. Almost every other European country, like the Germans, the Dutch, the Belgians, Ford Foundation, the Arab Fund for Economic Development in Kuwait had become increasingly the second in funding us after the Swedish. UNDP, sometimes we do projects with them. We don't get any funding from the PNA because the PNA needs the fund, actually. We are happy if they don't take our money, so it's the other way around. They hardly have money, and that's why I think this is another issue we don't have much time to talk about. The role of the NGO in Palestine is incredibly stronger than the government in many areas. So that's something that gives us a lot of space to work on. Now, the issue of water is another difficult issue because, as we know, part of the problem with our conflict with Israel is our rights over water. They consume 90% of the water and we consume 10% of the water, of our own water. So it is quite a bit of a problem, and actually you start feeling it on everyday level, where you don't have water every day in many of the Palestinian towns and villages. So it is quite a problem. And that's why I think the whole issue of having water wells should come back, because traditionally every single house used to have a water well. And if I were the mayor, I would make that obligatory. They haven't done that yet. The issue of sewage is a big problem in Palestine. The reason for that, again, is whenever you want to have a treatment plant for a city like Ramallah or El Bire together, you need a sewage plant, how do you call it, a treatment plant, and it has to be in sea area. And the Israelis will not give us a permit unless we agree that there will be peace between the settlers, that our sewage and the settlers' sewage will be together. That's their vision of peace with the Palestinians. And, you know, we hope for more than that. So there has been problems with really, you will be surprised that, for example, in a place like Ramallah, the old centers, the historic centers where we work have sewage treatment, sewage pipes from the Roman periods, but the new modern areas in Palestine don't have. So sewage, so unfortunately up till now we all have septic tanks. And that, you know how terrible it is for the environment and seeping water and pollution, but I am not an expert on water and sewage really in Palestine, but I know that there are quite serious issues. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if Ruwaq works at all with refugee camps in the area, and if so, maybe not so much preservation, maybe renovation, and if there's a collaboration with UNRWA at all.
The simple question, the simple answer is no, the short answer is no, and the long answer is yes. Now, the short answer is no, because really, as you all know, the refugees has been created in as a result of 1948. So these are areas which we have not yet considered historic, but maybe soon, as the question raised here, which years are historic. Soon, some of these places will have to be preserved and have to be registered and considered really historic, as we all know that the value of a building is not only the material value, but also the social and political event that could have happened. The only way we work with the Jalazon camp is that we have done something I didn't mention to you. We have done a program which deals with trails. We don't only deal with single buildings or with villages or historic sites. We try to make a trail to connect the landscape with the villages, with the archaeological site, and with and part of that is social. And Jalazon camp, which is one of the camps next to Ramallah, is part of our trail to understand the historic context and the social context of the environment. So in that respect, we have Jalazon as part of our, we are part of a Euromed project, and this is, now the new director of Ruwaq actually is an anthropologist, and his main research is on refugee camps, and it has to do with memory and space. So that's why I told you in a short answer, no, in a long answer, yes. So if you are interested in that, you write to the new director of Ruwaq, and he is a specialist on refugee memory and space. And what he's studying basically is how people, when they came back home, even though it was UNRWA that built the houses for them, how they agglomerated depending on which village, which community they came. So they tried to recreate their villages in the camps. Yes, please. Yes.
Have you ever come in contact with a municipality that wasn't really easy to work with, or that didn't want REWAC's help?
Yeah.
And in places where there's a more robust private market, like in Jordan or Lebanon, can this model be exported where maybe the private market isn't really interested in conservation?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be Jordan, it's also Palestine. It's not interested. We are doing the work in spite. The municipalities, it's a good question. Yes, we have actually. I can tell you that the success or failure of our project normally depends on the local community, whether it being the municipality or the people in general who are interested or not interested. The success depends a great deal on the municipality. As I told you, the project that we took, because we didn't think we will be successful, the municipality turned out to be so active that it was a success story. We have a case in a village where the mayor, if it's not his house or his brother's house or his uncle's house, he's not interested. So we have cases. Actually, we once stopped a project which was a $220,000 conservation of a house, a palace, because the neighbor would not cooperate. And the municipality didn't want to do anything about it. So we said goodbye. I mean, the community was really, we realized we cannot do much if the community is not interested. And that's why I really think that 90% of the work is drinking tea and coffees. And if I have an ulcer, that is why, that is my job in REWAC. It's just you have to connect with the people. Other work, the work doesn't happen. But yes, we have encountered cases where we weren't successful because the mayor was very...
I was just wondering if you have other allies in your work. I know you pair with municipalities on a local level. But it seems like it's very ambitious work.
Yeah. No, I am thankful to you because you have mentioned what we call our partners. And we are proud of them. We are so proud that I forgot them. I forgot to mention them. You know, our partners first, really, the cultural centers. You could feel it perhaps from the two films that we do connect with cultural centers in Ramallah, but also in the village. It is very important for us to bring life. So we have a lot of projects, for example, with the Music Conservatory. We connect with cultural organizations because those organizations want to have centers all over the villages. So instead of us going and do any kind of activity, we connect with the music center, and it is the one who choose the building, and it's the one who decide, and we have seen some of their work here. So our partners are the cultural centers, our partners are the municipality, our partners are the students of Birzeit and the universities. Our partners is what we call Friends of REWAC, which are young people that you have seen some of them who are interested to know about cultural heritage, because we do have a lecture series like now, and we have what we call REWAC Trip. We just take people for fun, you know, it doesn't have to be serious hard work. People just go to villages. We have the Biennale that I didn't have a chance to talk about. Every 2 years we do have REWAC's Biennale, in which we involve the local community. We don't do our conference in a hotel or in Ramallah. We do our conferences in the villages. And we bring, you know, experts from all over the world, not only architects, but artists and anthropologists and name it. And they come to these villages, look at it, and they all have contributions. And so these are our partners. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.